September 15, 2008. Lower Manhattan. The air smells faintly of burnt coffee and hot asphalt. Sirens echo between steel and glass towers as traders cluster around glowing screens inside Lehman Brothers headquarters. Phones ring without pause. Faces pale. A rumor, then a confirmation, moves faster than any market order ever could. Lehman Brothers is bankrupt. Outside, the city keeps moving. Taxis crawl through traffic. Coffee shops open their doors. Most people have no idea that, at this exact moment, the financial system underpinning their mortgages, pensions, salaries, and savings is just fractured. What few realize then or now is that Lehman's collapse was not an accident. It was a tremor along a fault line that has been widening for more than 3 centuries. Because behind the panic of that morning lay a far bigger, quieter question, one rarely asked aloud. If everyone owes money, who is owed? Today, global debt stands at $317 trillion. The United States owes more than $36 trillion. China, $15 trillion. Japan, $10 trillion. Europe, emerging markets, developing nations, all deeply indebted. In total, the world owes more than 3 times what it produces in a year. And yet debt, by definition, is not a void. It is not a fog. It is a contract. For every borrower, there must be a lender. For every obligation, an owner. For every dollar owed, a dollar held. Which raises the paradox at the heart of the modern economy. If every major nation is in debt, who holds the world's money? To understand the answer, we must step backward, far beyond modern trading floors and digital ledgers, into candlelit rooms where the architecture of today's system was first drawn. London, 1694. England is exhausted by war. The crown is nearly bankrupt, unable to fund its navy or defend its trade routes. Taxes are insufficient. Coinage is scarce. Confidence is collapsing. A group of merchants and financiers offers a solution. They will lend money to the government, not once, but permanently, in exchange for something revolutionary: the right to create money as interest-bearing debt. Thus, the Bank of England is born. For the first time in history, money is no longer tied to gold alone or royal decree. It is tied to credit, to borrowing, to obligation. And from this moment forward, a new system begins to spread quietly, methodically, across empires and centuries. By the 19th century, central banking has become the financial backbone of industrial nations. By the 20th century, debt finances world wars. By the late 20th century, currencies float freely, untethered from gold, expanding the system beyond any physical limit. Each innovation promises stability. Each solution introduces more leverage. Each crisis demands more debt to resolve the last. The system does not collapse. It compounds. By the early 21st century, money itself has changed form. No longer coins. No longer notes. Mostly entries in databases, created when banks lend, erased when loans are repaid. But here is the detail rarely explained. When money is created through lending, only the principal is created, not the interest. The interest must come from somewhere else. From future borrowing. From higher taxes. From wage compression. From asset sales. This is not ideology. It is arithmetic. And arithmetic does not negotiate. As debt grows, so does an invisible transfer, small at first, then massive. Interest flows upward, from households to banks, from workers to institutions, from governments to bondholders. Over decades, this flow reshapes society. Wealth concentrates. Assets consolidate. Risk socializes downward while returns rise upward. Yet the process remains largely unseen, buried in balance sheets, pension funds, sovereign bonds, and safe assets. By the time Lehman collapses in 2008, the system is no longer fragile. It is interconnected. Banks are no longer just lenders. They are counterparties. Governments are no longer just borrowers. They are guarantors. When the system freezes, central banks respond not with restraint, but with scale. Trillions are created. Rates fall to zero. Debt becomes permanent policy. The crisis passes. the structure remains, and global debt accelerates faster than ever before. Which brings us back to the question. $317 trillion is owed. That debt does not float in the air. It sits on balance sheets. It earns interest. It conveys power. Someone owns it. But ownership in the modern system is rarely obvious. It does not appear as a single name, or a single institution, or a single nation. It appears as layers: central banks, institutional investors, sovereign funds, private wealth. And beneath those layers lies a concentration so extreme that it reshapes politics, markets, and history itself. This documentary is not about villains. It is not about secret meetings or hidden handshakes. It is about design, a system built to expand, a mechanism that rewards ownership over labor, a structure where debt cannot disappear, only migrate. Over the next chapters, we will trace how money is created, who ultimately owns the world's obligations, why debt can never fully be repaid, and what history tells us happens next. Because when debt grows faster than the real economy, the question is no longer if the system changes, but how, when, and who pays the price. The world owes $317 trillion. This is the story of who gets paid. Numbers lose meaning when they grow too large. 1 million seconds is 11 days. 1 billion seconds is 31 years. 1 trillion seconds is more than 31,000 years. Now imagine $317 trillion. This is not a statistic. It is a structure. As of the early 2020s, global debt equals more than 330% of global GDP. In plain terms, the world owes more than 3 years of total economic output, assuming every human stopped eating, traveling, or surviving and worked only to repay debt. That alone should raise alarms. But the real question is not how much is owed. It is to whom. Debt is often spoken about as if it were fog, everywhere, yet owned by no one. That is an illusion. Debt is a contract, a legal claim, an asset. On one side of a ledger is obligation. On the other side is ownership. When the U.S. Treasury issues a bond, it is not destroying money. It is creating an income stream for whoever holds that bond. When a household takes a mortgage, it is not just buying a home. It is funding decades of predictable payments to a lender. Debt does not disappear into the system. It accumulates within it. The first visible holders of global debt are central banks. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England. Together, they hold roughly $25 trillion in government bonds and financial assets. Since the 2008 crisis, and even more aggressively after 2020, central banks have purchased debt on a scale never seen in history. This process, known as quantitative easing, is often described as money printing. But in reality, it is asset swapping. Central banks create reserves and use them to buy government bonds, removing risk from private markets and placing it onto public balance sheets. And here lies a widely misunderstood fact. Most central banks are not traditional government agencies. The U.S. Federal Reserve, for example, is a hybrid institution. Its regional banks are owned by private member banks, which receive guaranteed dividends by law. These member banks include the largest financial institutions on earth. This does not mean central banks are conspiracies. It means they are structurally aligned with financial stability, not public equality. They exist to preserve the system, not to redistribute it. The largest holders of global debt are not governments. They are institutions, pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, sovereign wealth funds. Together, they hold more than $120 trillion in bonds and fixed income assets. On the surface, this appears democratic. After all, pensions belong to workers. Insurance serves policyholders. But ownership within these vehicles is deeply concentrated. In the United States and most developed economies, the top 10% of households own nearly 90% of all financial assets, including stocks, bonds, and fund shares. Pension systems themselves are often invested through the same asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, whose incentives prioritize stability, yield, and scale. This creates a feedback loop. Governments issue debt, institutions, by its central banks backstop it, asset managers collect fees, wealth concentrates upward. The system functions smoothly until growth slows. The next major creditors are foreign states. China holds more than $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. Japan holds even more. A large portion of this wealth sits in U.S. Treasury securities. These holdings are often framed as geopolitical leverage. In reality, they are defensive positions, ways to stabilize currencies, manage trade surpluses, and preserve export competitiveness. But here is the key point. These reserves are not owned by citizens. They are controlled by central banks and finance ministries, elite institutions operating far from democratic oversight. When interest is paid on sovereign debt, it does not flow to workers in Beijing or Tokyo. It flows into state balance sheets, reinforcing political and financial power at the top. Finally, there is direct private ownership. The global top 1% controls roughly $40 trillion in financial assets. Within that group, the top 0.01%, approximately 800,000 individuals or families, control about $10 trillion. These are not just wealthy people. They are systemic lenders. They hold government bonds, corporate debt, structured products, private credit, and real asset-backed securities. Their portfolios are diversified across currencies, jurisdictions, and legal systems. When governments borrow, these individuals are paid. When inflation rises, their assets adjust. When crises hit, they are often rescued explicitly or implicitly. When we total the major categories: central banks, $25T institutional investors, $120T foreign governments, $30T wealthy individuals, $40T. That equals $215 trillion. The remaining $102 trillion is spread across smaller institutions, corporate treasuries, regional banks, and retirement accounts, still overwhelmingly concentrated among higher-income households. The conclusion is unavoidable. Global debt is owned not by everyone, but by a narrow financial elite operating through layers of institutions. Now we arrive at the core mechanism. When money is created through debt, only the principal is created. If a government borrows $1 trillion at 5% interest, it must repay $1.05 trillion. But only $1 trillion exists. The additional $50 billion must come from future borrowing, increased taxation, reduced public services, or private sector extraction. This creates a permanent imbalance. The system requires continuous expansion to remain solvent. Debt must grow to pay interest on past debt. This is not policy. It is mathematics. In aggregate, total debt always exceeds the available money supply. This means not all debts can be settled simultaneously. Defaults are inevitable. Inflation becomes a release valve. Historically, societies resolve this imbalance in only three ways: default, explicit or implicit inflation, reducing real value of obligations, debt jubilees, restructuring, or erasing liabilities. Each method redistributes wealth, and each tends to favor those who hold real assets over those who earn wages. Every year, approximately $15 trillion flows globally from borrowers to lenders in the form of interest. Estimates suggest top 1% capture, 40% top 0.1% capture, 20% top 0.01% capture, 10%. That means around 800,000 people receive roughly $1.875 million per year each, not from productivity, but from ownership, paid by workers through suppressed wages, consumers through higher prices, citizens through taxes. This is the engine of modern wealth concentration. This system was not built overnight. It evolved from war, finance, industrialization, colonial, trade, financial globalization. Each step solved an immediate problem, while creating a longer-term dependency on debt. No single group controls it, but those who own assets benefit disproportionately from its continuation. Global debt has roughly doubled every decade, from $100 trillion to $200 trillion to $317 trillion. At current trajectories, it will exceed $500 trillion by the mid-2030s. But the real economy, labor, resources, energy, cannot compound forever. At some point, the system reaches its limits. History suggests what follows. Empires do not collapse because of debt alone. They collapse when debt growth exceeds productivity, social, trust, political legitimacy. Rome debased its currency. France defaulted. Germany inflated. Modern states use financial repression. Different methods. Same outcome. The question is not whether the system changes. It is who absorbs the loss. So we return to where we began. The world owes $317 trillion. The lender is not a mystery. It is not everyone. It is a small global ownership class operating through central banks, institutional capital, sovereign reserves, private wealth. This is the architecture of modern finance, and it is reaching its limits. A city wakes up. Lights flicker on in apartment towers. Trains rumble underground. Delivery trucks idle at intersections. Somewhere, a government bond auction clears quietly. Somewhere else, interest payments move between accounts, digits shifting unnoticed. Nothing feels unusual. And yet, beneath this ordinary rhythm, the largest financial structure ever built continues to hum, vast, complex, and increasingly strained. A system holding $317 trillion in promises. What we have seen. Over the course of this story, one truth has emerged with clarity. Global debt is not a shared burden. It is a concentrated asset. The world does not owe money to itself. It owes money to owners. Owners hidden behind layers of institutions. Owners insulated by diversification. Owners positioned to survive outcomes that devastate others. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observation. Debt, by design, transfers wealth upward, slowly, legally, relentlessly. The system's final contradiction. The global debt system rests on a single, unavoidable contradiction. It must grow forever in a finite world. Debt compounds. Interest accumulates. Claims multiply. But productivity has limits. Resources are constrained. Populations age. Energy becomes more expensive. At some point, the growth required to sustain the debt exceeds what society can produce without breaking. History shows that when this point is reached, the math always wins. Not ideology, not politics, not promises. How history always resolves this. Every civilization that built a debt-based monetary system eventually faced the same choice. They could not pay everything, so they chose how the losses would be distributed. Ancient Mesopotamia used jubilees, canceling debts to prevent social collapse. The Roman Empire debased its currency until trust evaporated. Medieval monarchs defaulted openly. The 20th century used inflation, war, and financial repression. The method changes. The outcome does not. Wealth shifts. Power consolidates. The middle absorbs the shock. The three endings, revisited. As global debt pushes past historic thresholds, only three endings remain possible. Default, explicit or hidden, through bankruptcies, restructurings, or pension resets. Contracts are broken. Confidence collapses. Those without leverage suffer first. Inflation, the most politically acceptable option. Debts are paid, but in devalued currency. Savings erode. Wages lag. Asset holders adapt. Inflation does not destroy debt. It destroys purchasing power. Jubilee. Rare. Disruptive. Historically necessary, but politically difficult. Debts are written down. Losses are acknowledged. The system resets. Every society resists this option until the alternatives become unbearable. Why the elite survive each time. No matter which ending unfolds, history reveals a pattern. Those who own hard assets, control institutions, hold claims across borders, influence policy, tend to emerge intact or stronger. They hedge against default. They benefit from inflation. They shape jubilees. Meanwhile, those whose wealth exists primarily as wages, savings, pensions, local currency claims, bear the adjustment. This is not conspiracy. It is positioning. The silent transfer continues. Until the moment of rupture, the system keeps doing what it was designed to do. Every year, interest flows upward. Leverage increases. Inequality widens. And because the process is slow, legal, and complex, it feels invisible. There is no villain, no announcement, no single decision, just compounding. Why this moment is different. Every generation believes its challenges are unique. But this moment carries features history has never seen simultaneously. Globalized finance, instant capital movement, trillions created digitally, aging populations, our resource constraints, political polarization. The margin for error is thinner than ever. And unlike past eras, there is no untouched frontier left to absorb the excess. The real question is not, who is the creditor? We began with a simple question. If everyone owes money, who is the creditor? We now know the answer. But the deeper question is more uncomfortable. How long can a system survive when ownership and obligation drift this far apart? When trust erodes? When growth stalls? When legitimacy weakens? History suggests, not indefinitely. What this means for the present. This story is not about fear. It is about awareness. Debt is not inherently evil. Credit built the modern world. But systems must match reality. When financial claims outgrow human capacity, adjustment becomes inevitable, planned or chaotic. Understanding the structure does not predict the future. It prepares you for it. The final image. Somewhere tonight, as cities dim and markets close, interest will still accrue. Quietly, automatically, indifferently. The system does not care who understands it. It only responds to arithmetic. $317 trillion is owed. It belongs to someone. And the clock is always running. Closing reflection. Empires are not remembered for their balance sheets. They are remembered for how they treated those who lived within them, especially at the moment of reckoning. Whether this era chooses inflation, default, jubilee, or something new, will define not just markets, but lives. This was the story behind the number. The creditor is known. The outcome is unwritten. The only question left is whether society understands the system before the system forces understanding upon it.